All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to decode a really important and kind of tricky economic puzzle in India. We're talking about the recent GST simplification. Now, it's a huge step forward for sure, but it's also left behind this really persistent challenge, a little something called the inverted duty structure.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll tackle the big challenge within the GST reform itself. Then, we'll get into what this inverted duty structure thing actually is. After that, we'll look at the good news, the sectors where it got fixed, and then the not-so-good news where new problems popped up. And we'll finish everything off with some solid takeaways for your exams.
So first up, the GST reform. Moving India's GST into a simpler two-slab system, that's a huge win for the economy. But, and you knew there was a but coming, it came with a catch. It didn't quite solve everything.
And that catch has a name. Hiding in the shadows of this big reform is a major structural problem, the inverted duty structure, or IDS for short. And believe me, this thing is a massive headache, especially for India's domestic manufacturers.
Okay, so what in the world is this inverted duty structure? Let's really break it down, because understanding this is key to seeing the real-world problems it's causing our economy. So here it is in simple terms. An inverted duty structure is when the tax you pay on your raw materials, your inputs, is actually higher than the tax you get to charge on your final finished product. You can see the problem right away, can't you? This mismatch creates a huge cash flow nightmare for businesses.
And this kicks off a really vicious cycle. Think about it. A business, especially a small one, has to pay a high tax upfront for its materials. Now that tax money becomes something called an input tax credit, or ITC. The idea is you use this credit to pay the tax on your final sales. But wait, the tax on your final sale is lower, so you can't use all your credit. It just piles up, locked away. The only way to get that money back is through a slow, difficult refund process that just sucks the lifeblood, their working capital, right out of the business.
This chart shows the problem perfectly. Just look at those numbers. You're paying an 18% tax on your supplies, but you can only collect 5% tax on what you sell. That massive gap between the two, that's where a company's money, its vital working capital, gets trapped in the system. It's just stuck.
All right, enough of the problem. Let's talk about the good news. Because the GST reform actually did a great job of targeting and fixing this inversion in some really important sectors. Let's see where things went right.
Now, for your exams, this is a list you'll want to remember. A good way to do it is to group them together. So think about everything related to farmers and food. We've got fertilizers, farm machinery, dairy, and fisheries. Then you've got your core manufacturing and tech sectors, textiles, solar, and electronics. Grouping them like that makes it way easier to recall under pressure.
Let's take textiles. It's a textbook example. Before the change, manufacturers were getting hammered. They paid 18% tax on man-made fiber, but could only charge 5% on the clothes they sold. It was a classic case of severe IDS. So what did the reform do? Boom! It slashed the input tax down to 5%, making it a perfect match with the output tax. Problem solved. The financial strain on these businesses was eased, just like that.
We saw a similar big win in the fertilizer sector. It was the same story. 18% tax on key chemicals, but only 5% on the final fertilizer. By aligning those rates, the government didn't just help the companies. We're talking about saving the industry billions in locked-up refunds. And, just as importantly, that helps bring down costs for farmers, a win-win.
But as we mentioned, this reform was a bit of a double-edged sword. For every problem it solved, the same changes accidentally created new ones, or even made existing problems worse in other sectors.
This is where you really see the law of unintended consequences in action. Let's dive into a few specific examples to see exactly how this happened.
So let's look at pharmaceuticals. The goal here was great, right? Make medicines cheaper for everyone. But look what happened. They cut the tax on the final medicine down to 5%. But they kept the tax on the raw materials, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, way up at 18%. So the tax gap, that inversion, didn't just get bigger, it more than doubled. The working capital problem for drug makers actually got worse. And it wasn't just about making old problems worse. For industries like bicycles and tractors, the reform created a brand new problem. Before, things were mostly fine. But now, the final product tax is down at 5%, while the steel needed to build them is still taxed at 18%. Suddenly, you've got this huge 13% tax gap that just wasn't there before.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. This is your revision guide, the stuff you really need to lock in for your exams.
Let's start with the core concepts. 1. GST reform simplified the rates, mostly to 5% and 18%.
2. Inverted duty structure, or IDS, is when your input tax is higher than your output tax. Simple as that. 3. Input tax credit, or ITC, is the mechanism that gets all tangled up, trapping working capital and forcing businesses to chase refunds. And finally, the core issue at the heart of it all, it's that huge gap between the 5% and 18% slabs. That's what's causing all the trouble.
All right, here's your quick list of the success stories. The sectors where IDS was fixed. We have textiles with the input tax cut from 18 down to 5. Fertilizers and agriculture where key chemical inputs got the same treatment. Solar energy, farm machinery, dairy, fisheries, electronics. You see the pattern, right? In every case, the solution was to bring the input tax down to match the output tax. That's the key.
And now for the other side of the coin, the sectors with new or bigger problems. In pharmaceuticals, the tax cap actually widened. For bicycles and tractors, a completely new inversion was created thanks to that 18% steel tax. And you even see it in consumer goods, where packaging materials are taxed higher than the products inside. The pattern here is the complete opposite. They cut the tax on the final product without touching the high tax on the inputs. That's the recipe for IDS.
This quote from Pramod Sinha at NIPFP really sums it up perfectly. The GST changes were a big step, no doubt. But the fact that this inverted duty structure is still around, and in some cases even getting worse, it just goes to show that the job is far from done. This puzzle is still a critical challenge for Indian manufacturing.
And that leaves us with a million-dollar question for policymakers, and maybe for you to think about in your analysis. As India moves forward, how can the government possibly close that gap between the tax slabs to finally finish the GST reform without sending consumer prices through the roof? It's a tough one.
We really hope this deep dive helped you get your head around the inverted duty structure. For more explainers just like this, designed to help with your exams, make sure you check out our other videos. And hey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. Thanks for tuning in.